Welcome to part 4 of the trunk lesson. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the nerves of the trunk. So the nerves of the torso include the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves innervate their particular segment, right? That is, the skin, the dermatome, the muscles, and the bones are all innervated by a particular spinal nerve within that segment. Okay? Spinal nerves contain both sensory and motor information. Okay, so sensory being just, what is the temperature? Are we experiencing pain? Is there stretch? Like, what are we sensing? What is going on in that particular segment? And that information, as we know, is detected in the periphery. Action potentials are generated in these sensory nerves. The action potentials travel all the way up the nerves, and they're going to enter into the spinal cord via the dorsal root. Okay, so in this model from the lab, we could imagine that sensory information is passed along the spinal nerve and enters into the spinal cord on the dorsal side. Okay. The information is called both sensory and it's called afferent, which I will emphasize as afferent. I know that's not how the word is actually said, but I will say afferent because it sounds super close, or because afferent sounds really close to efferent. Okay, so afferent information, it approaches the spinal cord of the central nervous system. Spinal nerves also contain motor information, right? So once the sensory information arrives at the spinal cord and maybe even is passed up to the brain, a decision is made, and that motor decision, right? Are we going to leave our hand on the hot stove? Are we going to, or are we going to move it away from the hot stove, right? So this motor command is going to be sent out through the ventral side, the ventral root, down the spinal nerve and to the appropriate tissue within that segment. Okay, so this information is called motor information. It's also called efferent information. So efferent information exits, afferent approaches, it enters the central nervous system. Okay. The interface between sensory neurons and motor neurons occurs within the central nervous system. This includes both the spinal cord and the brain. Okay, so in the region that we're talking about, the spinal cord. Okay. Sensory neurons, we have talked about some sensory structures of the skin already, so we can see these structures here are sensing some fine touch. Up here within the epidermis, we can see these lamellar corpuscles, which sense kind of like deeper pressure through the skin. The more of those fatty layers are compressed, the stronger the signal is going to be. Right? So a lot of different sensory structures within the skin and within the muscles and bones as well. In general, sensory neurons are structured in the same way. And that way is that they are unipolar neurons. Unipolar neurons have one attachment site between the neuron cell body and the axon. Right? So one connection between the neuron cell body and the axons. In this way, we have dendrites, which are in a very localized region. Anything that they sense is then sent along the axon to the synaptic terminals, which will be, in this case, in the spinal cord. Right? So lots of different sensory neurons in different places. And so every neuron is telling the spinal cord, it's telling the central nervous system what is happening in a very fine little place. Okay. In the spinal nerves and the peripheral nerves that are like out in the rest of the body, the sensory neurons are bundled together with the motor neurons, and they're bundled together in a very particular way that hopefully starts to feel pretty similar. Okay, so here we have a sensory neuron. It is wrapped with a connective tissue sheath called an endoneurium. So endo all the way on the inside, this looks like a neuron. Okay, multiple neurons, each surrounded by their own endoneurium, are bundled together. The bundle itself is called a fascicle, and it's surrounded by a peri around the perimeter of the fascicle neurium. Finally, multiple fascicles are bundled together, all surrounded by another connective tissue sheath. The whole nerve, in this case, is surrounded by an epi, so on top of the entire neuron or nervous system structure. And I said it might seem familiar because this is exactly the same kind of a nested structure that we see in our muscles, right? So an individual muscle cell is covered by an endomysium. Bundle of muscle cells is a fascicle and is surrounded by a perimysium. The whole muscle is surrounded by the epimysium. Okay, so same exact nested structure. The only thing that you change is the nerve for the mice. Okay, so looking back at the spinal cord, here we can see a spinal nerve. Right, so this whole thing here is a spinal nerve, and we see a single sensory neuron, which is bundled together, right, within fascicles, within the entire nerve. And the sensory neuron carries information via action potentials, and they branch, right, essentially entering the spinal cord from the dorsal side. So this entire structure here is the dorsal root. It only contains sensory neuron cell bodies, and therefore it only carries sensory information. Remember that these cells are unipolar, and so their neuron cell bodies are just kind of like hanging off to one side. In this case, the neuron cell bodies are grouped together all in this one little bulbous structure called the dorsal root ganglion. So a ganglion is just a group of neuron cell bodies, in this case, outside of the central nervous system. Okay. Remember that all of these structures are passing through the holes in between the vertebrae. So these intervertebral foramina. Okay, so passing through right here. Once the action potential reaches the spinal cord, right, this message has to then be relayed to another neuron. We have to actually pass this message along. And so where those synapses are located is in what is called the dorsal horn. So this entire shape here is called the gray matter. Okay, and this kind of leg, this extension of essentially this butterfly shape, is specifically the dorsal horn. So this is where the axon terminal is. It is going to synapse with another neuron, therefore relaying the information about what is happening out in the extremities. Okay, so what does the dorsal root and of course ventral root have to pass through to actually get to the spinal cord? Well, the central nervous system, the entire central nervous system, including the brain, is surrounded by multiple layers of protective tissues. Okay, so multiple specialized membranes collectively called the meninges. And so this name might sound familiar because meningitis is an itis and inflammation of the meninges. Okay, so if we take a look here, this is the posterior side of a neuron, a thoracic neuron at that. So here is those little costal facets. We can see that the dorsal and ventral roots and the spinal nerves are passing out through what will be an intervertebral foramina or foramen. And there are membranes covering the entire spinal cord. If we take a transverse section, we see this down here, and moving from superficial layer all the way deep to actually like touching the spinal cord. The very first one is the dura mater. So it is super durable. In fact, later when we dissect a sheep brain, we're actually going to see just how durable it is and actually like cut through that on the brain. So this is fibrous connective tissue. We can also see that there is some fat surrounding the spinal cord on the outside of the dura mater. This is just for some insulation and protection. Okay, so it's not like banging the sides of the vertebral foramen. Deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater. And so this is called arachnoid because it has these little protein fibers, like little legs here, and they kind of sort of look like spider's legs if you use your imagination. Okay, so this is the arachnoid mater, and the reason why there are these little spider-like filaments is that the arachnoid mater needs to keep some space between it and the next layer down. And the reason we need space is because we need to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid bathes over the surface of the spinal cord, over the surface of the brain, and also passes through this central canal. Right? So cerebrospinal fluid is bathing over all of the structures of the central nervous system. Finally, the pia mater, or pia mater, you can pronounce it, is what is actually touching the spinal cord. So we can see this little white layer on the surface of the spinal cord. This is super stretchy, so even when you are doing all these crazy yoga poses, right, you're flexing your spine, extending your spine, and laterally flexing your spine to either direction, the spinal cord has a little bit of stretch to it. Okay, so again, superficial to deep, dura, arachnoid, and pia. Thank you. Stay tuned for the next video.